What's going on, guys? My name is Dan Weichart. Welcome to the inaugural podcast of Weichart Media. I've been out there on a couple of things before, so my goal here is to provide potentially new perspectives on some of the world's most controversial topics. So, I wanted to launch this first one out with the idea of multiculturalism and its benefits. And this kind of really ties into the concept of this idea of diversity being our strength as another topic. So, as a brief summation of my point, I don't think that multiculturalism nor diversity is inherently a good thing. At best, it tends to be neutral. There are certain aspects where multiculturalism or diversity, especially if you're talking about superficial diversity like skin color and things like that, has very little to inform a particular topic, and I'll get into more what I mean by that, but generally speaking, it's really not that great. Because what we've seen in the West's attempt to foist this idea of diversity and multiculturalism on itself to kind of become these bastions of it, what we've discovered is that it has not good results, both for what you might call the dominant culture in an environment, as well as, and when I say subcultures, I just mean cultures that aren't the current dominant one, but that in subcultures that try to exist alongside or within, especially when those subcultures or alternate cultures are fundamentally anathema at certain points to the primary culture of a given country or region. Very reminiscent of Sam Huntington's Clash of Cultures sort of thesis about how and where conflict opens up in the modern world post the Soviet versus the U.S., post that really big communist versus capitalist block. So to dive in, so what brought this story about, and I searched for a solid 2 hours trying to recover this clip. I came across a clip the other day. It was of what appeared to be a graduation ceremony where a young Muslim man was walking across the stage, and he simply refused to shake the hand of his female headmistress. And I believe this was in Oslo, which I believe is Norway, if I'm not mistaken. And so the headmistress then launched into this big tirade where effectively she states that this is Norway. You're going to have to get used to working alongside women. We're a liberal society. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but we're a liberal society. If you find it unacceptable to work alongside women, then Norway's not the place for you. And let me back up. I don't know that she says Norway's not the place for you, but she essentially admonishes the crowd that they need to get used to working alongside of women. Now, at the time when I dug into this particular topic or that particular thread, allegedly, prior to that, the young man who's videotaped in the clip, the crowd is coming through, and as other young men walk up and shake this lady's hand, members of the crowd are shouting haram, which in typical Arabic means forbidden. And then as another aside, as I research this topic, because it's curious as to why do Muslims tend not to shake the hand or touch in any way, shape, or form the opposite sex. And as far as I can tell, the simple solution to this, the simple boil down is Muhammad said not to, according to all the reading and all the reading that I could find on it. It boils down to Muhammad said not to, which, quite frankly, when you're talking about a religion, is fine. If there are people out there who are Muslims following closely the words of the Quran and the Hadith and all these, the fact that the Prophet Muhammad would say not to do something seems pretty straightforward. Prophet says don't do it, we don't do it. I don't question, if I imagine if I were a Muslim and I believed in Allah and that Muhammad was his prophet, why on God's green earth would I question the words of the prophet? Maybe I don't understand. Maybe I don't know. Do I think a handshake would be innocent enough? Maybe I do, but that's not my place. The prophet said not to, so I don't. The prophet said it is forbidden, so it is forbidden. It's that simple. Now, I'm not necessarily casting aspersions on the sort of clash of cultures mentality, but I think it's important for people to ask ourselves the question, as we have, our individual cultures across the West, the Mideast, the Far East, and so forth, and Africa, do we want to try and import individuals who are directly anathema to that particular culture, or our culture in particular, or our culture. So, in the example of the clip I'm referencing, we're talking about someone in Norway. Norway is distinctly a Western culture with a Christian background, European for sure. And a lot of the beliefs that European Christian and especially liberals have is directly in conflict with the belief that a lot of, at least to basically describe it as very conservative, very traditionalist, perhaps even fundamentalist Muslims have about not only the roles of men and women, but how men and women are meant to interplay with one another in common society. These things just don't mix. And that's not to say anything of those same groups of people's beliefs when it comes to hot button topics in today, like LGBTQ plus activism and things like that. Strangely enough, it's really not all that strange, not unpredictable. You're seeing a coalition of Christians and Muslims coming together to protest LGBTQ plus whatever activism that is making an ingress into schools and attempting to normalize that behavior to minors. Which, I mean, I don't know how else you call that, grooming to be, I don't know what else you call that. Maybe I'm not allowed to say the word grooming, who knows. But at the end of the day, both Christians and Muslims seem to agree that, and so do statistics, by the way, that, maybe 98 or more % of population Earth. I think if you're being even the most liberal with the calculation, something like 96% of population Earth is what you might call heteronormative, straight, simply men attracted to women, women attracted to men, and vice versa. So it makes sense as we're talking to kids, and this is, again, a little bit of an aside, makes sense as we're talking to kids and they're asking about how men and women react to one another. Start with the 96%, and then maybe when they're older, then we can describe, like, hey, why do these two men hug each other? Okay, well, that might be the time to explain that to the kid. But for most kids, again, 96 or more %, unless they're in like the heart of San Francisco or Washington, D.C., the vast majority of the relationship, or even there, the vast majority of the relationships they're going to observe are, again, what you might call heteronormative, which I hate using that term because that's certainly the activist left term, but just quite frankly, they're normal. Men liking women, women liking men. And if you're out there and you're of an alternate sexual orientation and you get offended about me calling being heterosexual normal, it is. Normal's normal, abnormal is simply not normal. It's not an insult, it's just a statement of fact. At any rate, but strangely enough, Christians and Muslims have come together on this particular topic. So there's actually agreement there, but there might not be agreement because I'm sure some Christians, once the dust settles from sort of the conflict with LGBTQ plus activism and sort of how we have these strange bedfellows between Muslims and Christians there. And again, I don't think it's really that strange. It shouldn't be unpredictable, or shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who has even moderate knowledge of what Muslims believe and what not even fundamentalists, but just Bible believing Christians believe. It should not be a surprise that there is a coalition between those two groups to fight, or not literally fight, but to socially and politically combat LGBTQ plus activism in the West. Now, beyond that, even amongst, say, Christians who would ally with Muslims in that regard, there is going to be some conflict down the road because there's places where they simply don't. For example, Islam contains Sharia law, which is a political prescription. Christianity and Judaism and a lot of other religions don't have that. But Christianity in particular, because we're here in the West, and the West is built on a Judeo-Christian moral framework. You don't have to believe for that to be the case, but it's important that you recognize that's where it's from. The liberalism and the society that we live in is a direct outgrowth of Judeo-Christian moral framework, even if we have in present day become more of a secular society overall. I would love to see us return to Christ as a country more broadly, but nevertheless, it is indeed the case that America and the West in general has certainly become a more secular country. Nevertheless, in the West's secularism, they're still built upon a Judeo-Christian framework. Some simple examples of that: ten guilty men should go free, lest one innocent man be punished. That's Blackstone's formulation. That's directly a correlation or directly related to the story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a biblical story. That's the reason we believe these things. Just as a simple example, but a ton of other concepts. Just the idea of, here in the West, we view mercy as a positive trait. That historically, that's not always been the case. A lot of times, one of my favorite movies of all time is Gladiator with Russell Crowe and Joaquin Phoenix. But there's a point in there where Joaquin Phoenix's character as the young emperor is considering what should people call him, and he references the idea of being called, and I forget his name in the movie, but whatever the merciful. Well, mercy in that day and age, and even prior, and even to a lot of degrees today, in some places, is not considered positive. It's considered a form of weakness, where if someone is deserving of punishment and deserving of wrath, you should give them that punishment and wrath. You should do away with your opponent in this regard. So the idea of being merciful is not considered a positive trait. It is a Judeo-Christian trait that mercy is something that is to be admired, something where someone is definitely deserving of a certain punishment, and you withhold that punishment as an act of mercy upon them. That's not always been the case. It's just not. And then quite frankly, well, I'll get down into the God-proof thing later, but that's another topic, let's say. So what I'm saying is that that's not always the case. I'm not saying that Muslims don't believe that mercy is important, but what I'm saying is that there are certainly clashes that are inevitable between the Christian world and the Muslim world. And that's certainly not the only one. That just seems to have drawn that out in my mind. When we look at it, you can look at, really, as far as I can tell, in today's day and age, you have a handful of blocks that have come to be prominent. You have the West, which consists of Europe, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and to a slightly lesser extent, but still in that same sphere, right adjacent to the West is I'll just go ahead and coin the term Western Asian countries, such as Japan and South Korea, which are the way they are largely because of they obviously have a strong cultural heritage, but post World War II and post the Korean War have a very decided an American presence, a Western presence that has definitely influenced the culture pretty thoroughly in that area. So you certainly see Korea is a great example. You see this really interesting fusion of Korean and Western culture. As another aside, if you haven't yet to have Korean fried chicken, I highly encourage you to do so. It's quite delicious. At any rate, so you have those type cultures. Then you have the Chinese bloc and sort of its subsets. So this is China, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Singapore. All those kind of are in that group. Then, of course, you have the Russians that kind of sit on their own. Russians or Slavic areas would sit on their own. So you have like Russia and Belarus and some of these other places, which are certainly in the news these days, but that's definitely a distinct culture in and of itself. And then that culture physically borders Europe, which is a Western culture. And then, of course, you have the Mideast, which has Russia to its north and China to its east. And then from there, you move over, and then you have all of Africa. Now, certainly Africa has a wide bevy of different peoples and cultures, and they often war with themselves quite fiercely. And so Africa is certainly still, to this day, mostly broken down along tribal lines, despite how the countries may be drawn up. Nevertheless, you can kind of consider, even though all those guys have individual differences within their different peoples, they all share a certain cluster of similarities that are fundamentally different from, the West, the Russians, Chinese, and sort of the Japanese, Korean bloc type individuals. So when we see these cultures, all these cultures are distinctly different in a ton of different ways. And interestingly enough, when you look at where these cultures touch one another, we're starting to see conflict, which breaks out along those borders. And so it seems that Sam Huntington, from back in the day when he proposed his theories of clash of civilization, that's Sam Huntington, a famous political scientist who postulated that in a post-Soviet world, what we would likely see is that conflict would begin to erupt along these cultural lines as opposed to ideological lines. Because prior to that, the Cold War, of course, you had the communist bloc individuals in Russia, and then you had the free market individuals or the capitalist individuals centered in the America, but the West in general. And so those were the key drivers of conflict. After the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, now we have multiple. So as I say all of that, I think it's important to note that as we look at not only how we deal with things geopolitically, but even when we look at things here domestically, and the big one being things like immigration, a lot of Western countries are massively importing cultures from across the world that are directly anathema to Western cultures. And just so I can head this off at the pass, someone's going to be like, oh my God, racist. No, get out of my face with that, please and thank you. A lot of these cultural components have little to nothing to do with racial groups. And in fact, even within these cultural groups that I've just mentioned, there are many peoples who would war with one another based on racial means. You need only look at the conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims, for example, to see an example of that. As I mentioned to you earlier, what you might consider African bloc cultures often war with themselves as well. While we don't war with one another, you can look at the distinct differences between America and Europe and even Australia. Really, America and Europe. I would kind of lump Australia into Europe, even though it's not in Europe. There are distinct cultural differences between those peoples. Now, it's just that Europeans and Americans and Canadians aren't at war with one another on a regular basis, but we still have distinct differences, right? And continue within our different racial groups. Earlier I'm referencing the Judeo-Christian foundation of the American moral tradition, but the West more broadly. Well, the Western moral tradition comes from really three main cities. It comes from Greek and Athenian reason, particularly, in combination with Roman civil order. Rome's modern day Mediterranean individuals. A Mediterranean person, I don't know that I would necessarily describe as white, just for the record. At any rate, so you have Greek reason, Roman civil order, and then out of Jerusalem comes the Judaism, which then becomes Christianity down the road, at least for me. But obviously Judaism still exists. Nevertheless, these individuals largely aren't white, especially in Jerusalem. A lot of Jews from back in the day, they're pretty dark individuals. You need only go to Israel today, and you can still see that. At any rate, so the foundations and the footprints of this culture, in fact, I'm a Christian myself. I well recognize the fact that Jesus Christ himself, when he was in man form on planet Earth, was likely a Middle Eastern-looking guy. That doesn't bother anybody. So the idea of these cultural elements coming forth, especially when we're talking about the West, Western culture is not inherently tied to any one ethnicity. And it's even in the same way as you might look at, Japanese culture. Certainly there are social elements that form up Japanese culture as an example. But Japanese culture is also inherently tied into being Japanese, right? Like literally being Japanese. I might be able to perfectly emulate Japanese language, writing, know the customs perfectly, all that stuff. I'm still a foreigner, right? There's no way for me to become Japanese. I might even be able to become a Japanese citizen down the road. I don't know the process, but theoretically I could do that. I'm still not going to be Japanese. Maybe my children's children might be considered Japanese once we intermarry into actual Japanese individuals. Still, I wouldn't be considered that. In fact, I have a good friend of mine who would herself consider herself Italian, but her family's not from Italy originally. She doesn't have an Italian last name. So even though she was born there, grew up there, speaks the language, loves the places, eats the food, all that stuff, she's still largely not considered Italian, right, by resident Italians. Now, thank God, American culture is not inherent or not linked to being white or brown or any other color or racial group. That's why in the very outset I was referring to the superficiality of skin color. I care a great deal more about what you believe. And in fact, as I use the example of Muslims, in the political spectrum of Muslims, there seems to be your quote unquote liberal Muslims, and then your your traditionalist, fundamentalist, radical, kind of in that order, moving to the conservative right on it within their realm. I don't particularly have a problem with your sort of what would be considered liberal in the Muslim world, because that would just be traditional. That's basically like me when it comes to how the world views. And if they liberalize us enough to leave each other alone, and we're not trying to, foist each other's beliefs on one another, I ain't got a problem with that. That's Western liberalism, if we're able to do that. Now, there's a lot of challenges imposed there, and there certainly can create some conflict there, so that still needs to be done with caution. Nevertheless, it does certainly seem possible. So, just in case anybody's heading off with the racist component, we can just get that out of the way right in here now. So, as I break this down, or as I get down to it, it's important to understand, as we're forming our views and opinions on various topics across the world, whether it's how the United States, for example, should conduct itself politically, how the U.S. should view itself, and on critical domestic issues like immigration. It's important to know, where are we importing people? What cultures are we importing into our country? And it makes a lot of sense to be extra scrupulous about that. Not to say that you disallow any particular group right off the cuff, but it's certainly very important that you take time on the immigration piece to actually ascertain, is it likely that these individuals are going to assimilate into American or English or Norwegian or vice versa, or any culture that happens to be receiving an immigrant? Are these individuals likely to assimilate into this culture and improve it, or are they going to cluster, create enclaves, which then will create clashes of civilizations within our own borders? And I think that's an important consideration. So anyway, that's pretty much the rundown and gist that I have of this one. So if you like this, please give me a like, comment, subscribe, give me a thumbs up here on Rumble. You can check us out on all social media at Weichart Media. Presently, I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and I think that's about it. Rumble, of course, as you view me here. So we thank you for checking us out, man, and look back to see for more. We should have a lot more regular content coming out, and so this is definitely a good inaugural launch. We'll catch you guys later. I've been Dan Weichart. Thank you for joining me. Y'all have a great rest of your day.